So thank you so much for this interview and this opportunity. I wanted to ask first, what does the word leadership mean for you?
For me, the word leadership means to find your own path that is in resonance with nature and is in resonance with compassion for the rest of humanity. And walking that path is leadership.
And how did you know then that you were a leader? When did that realization happen to you?
No, I've never seen myself through that lens. For me, finding the right thinking and the right action is more important. And the rest just flows.
I like that. Who inspired you the most for you to take a stand?
Well, when we were very young, my parents, because my parents taught us two things that I think are very, very valuable in life. The first thing they taught us was fearlessness because they practiced it themselves. And the second thing they taught us was simplicity. Because we live in a consumer society and enough is never enough. And they lived simplicity and transmitted simplicity to us. And then, of course, later, when I got involved in larger issues um, of international trade, that's when Gandhi started to inspire me.
You know, when they say, especially for women who become leaders, and sit in rooms sometimes where they're the only woman at the table, they say, when you have a seat at that table, like, make sure that you say that, you represent what, because you've got a seat there now. When you've been on so many tables, you've been invited to places, and I've seen you a lot of the time where you were the only woman there. Not only the only woman, but you didn't dress like that. You didn't want to fit in this boardroom or conference. I mean, how did that feel for you?
Well, the fact that most people who enjoy positions of power happen to be men and they happen to be in black or gray suits. And for me, I call a sari my 6 yards of freedom. But I would add, especially when they're hand woven and like this kanta sari, every stitch is a stitch of love. Every stitch is hand embroidered. Um, so I've ne- being the only woman, instead of feeling excluded because of that, I've, I feel more of myself, that this is me, you know?
And you stand there with a lot of confidence, which is extremely inspiring. You talk a lot about collaboration and the decentralization. And when I visited the seed bank earlier, I saw that, how you're preserving the seeds, but then you're also, in times of need, you're giving it to the people who need it. I mean, can you explain a little bit more about that decentralization idea?
Well, the modern age has been shaped by centralization. Centralization of political power. That's what, when national states were created, there was one place. Before that, there used to be kings and queens. But after that, there was leaders in one place. And it was a centralized idea. But even more than that, when globalization was made the dominant form of the economy, that too was centralized. That three companies will control all the media. When I was working with the issue of seed, 2 or 3 companies who originally were makers of pesticides and poisons will control the seed. So for me, decentralization is the nature of nature. Not only is nature self organized, nature is self organized in decentralization. And when Gandhi talked about Swaraj, and he wrote his book when he was fighting for the Indian community in South Africa, because they had written an Indian Act to exclude the Indian community. And after that, they created apartheid. But Gandhi wrote that book, Hind Swaraj, during his struggle for equality. And I remember this is what inspired me because part of it was compulsory registration of Indians. You have to be registered. And by being registered, you exclude yourself from professions, you exclude yourself from many, many activities. And the Indian community, with Gandhi's leadership, refused to cooperate with that compulsory registration. They said, all citizens are equal, white and black. Why should we be excluded from trading? Why should we be excluded from the professions we practiced? And the same is the issue of seed. Of course, they've tried to create an hierarchy of seed, but seed itself is an example of decentralization. We wouldn't have seeds if there wasn't an exchange. If there wasn't pollination, you wouldn't have seed. You know, so pollination is an exchange that creates new seed, and when consciously we we create economies like the seed, we create decentralized economies.
In the age we are today, where, digital ID is coming in, where there's more and more control, and they are trying to, monopolize everything, what would you say we can do in order to protect our sovereignty?
I think the first thing we have to do is not, if the digital world is becoming the way of control, then not becoming addicted to it is the way of freedom. You know, so to never forget how to write, how to read, you know, and if you are in the habit that the first thing you do when you wake up is look at your phone, then don't. And the way I do it is I keep my phone far away in some other room, you know. And anyway, with my illness for about 2 years, I've not even dealt with my phone.
That's true.
So to learn, after all, if the digital world is a recent creation, surely life went on before the digital world. So to never forget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great advice. I want to talk about feminism.
Yeah.
In today's age, feminism is equal to toxic masculinity. It has become now a weapon to push men down. So a lot of men suicide in the West is because of feminism. A lot of it is happening. They feel helpless. A lot of them, and it's probably different in India, but in the West, a lot went through the divorce. The woman has more power. The man normally loses a lot of, the house and the kids, and a lot of them are committing suicide more and more. But when you talk about ecofeminism, I don't see that hatred for men in your ecofeminism, on the contrary of what feminism is now becoming in the West. So how is your ecofeminism a unifying movement more than a division?
So, it isn't that I started out defining ecofeminism. I started out practicing uh, ecofeminism, which is simultaneously ecological. It's a liberation of nature and it's a liberation of women because these were the excluded categories with the rise of capitalist patriarchy. Capitalist patriarchy, first of all, put privilege in the hands of men and human beings. And the second thing it did was, with that privilege, women were disenfranchised, and of course, nature disappeared as a living system. So, my life's work has been everything alive is self organized, everything alive has its own meaning and its own entity. And ecofeminism basically means to recognize our partnership in the web of life. So a partnership in the web of life doesn't make either men above women or women above men. It gets rid of hierarchies of every kind.
Is that equality?
It's not equality in terms of sameness. It's equality in terms of equal respect, equal meaning,
And a collaboration, right?
and cooperation.
Cooperation
Yeah.
between the two.
Yeah.
Because
Because the dominant category with capitalist patriarchy was competition.
yes,
And an integrated web of life, ecofeminism, is creating the interconnectedness is through cooperation.
about your book, The Monoculture of the Mind, I was thinking about, and you also mentioned a colonized mind. How do we go through recultivating our mind? And
Yeah. So, the idea of monocultures of mind came to me that because all the scientific literature of our times was treating a natural forest as unproductive and a monoculture of eucalyptus as productive. It was treating a mixed farm as unproductive and a monoculture of green revolution chemical rice or chemical wheat as productive. And I said, and and I would do measurements both in agriculture and in forestry that a natural forest had was more productive if you take all the indicators. So I said, where does the idea of monocultures come from? Obviously, the earth doesn't give us the monocultures. It first comes in the mind. So first, the monoculture of the mind creates a mind that lets you think that everything has to be this one thing that is commercially valuable. So at that point, eucalyptus was valuable for pulp. So destroy all the forests and let pulp trees grow. And when they created the Green Revolution, it was all about chemicals. And so varieties were created that could use more chemicals. And the way to deal with a mind that's liberated is what I would call the diversity of the mind. The ability of the mind to be diverse and see diversity and relate to diversity.
in a world where fascism now is growing and nationalism is growing, and a lot of the movements are anti-diversity, they don't look at multicultural as a positive thing. They look at it as a negative thing. What would you say about this?
Well, I think it's precisely because the monoculture of the mind is leading to fascist tendencies that we need to create more diversity of the mind and respect diversity even more. It has now become, earlier it was an ecological imperative. It is now becoming a survival imperative.
And what would you say is the best way to do that?
I think the best way to cultivate the diversity of the mind is to first understand diversity. Whether it's the diversity of plants, to see all the plants around. For example, for Australia, it was always projected that the Aboriginal people were bushmen. They lived in a forest and that's it. And now recently, literature is coming out. I gave a talk at the Sydney Opera House, and the Sydney Opera House gifted me a book which I read on my flight back to India. And the book is called The Biggest Estate on Earth. And basically, it's a book that reclaims history and shows that actually Aboriginal people were farmers, not bushmen. And they talk about all the crops. There's another book called The Dark Emu, which is also about all the different crops that used to be cultivated and all the systems of farming. And because of the fact that eucalyptus is an Australian tree and forest fires were the natural way of recycling of nutrients, but the fires were managed. and certain patches they'd allow the fire to spread, and then they would farm it. So we are discovering new things, false assumptions about cultures, and now we are discovering no, they were not bushmen, they were farmers. And so how do we cultivate diversity of the mind? By understanding diversity, you know?
It's by breaking out of that echo chamber.
Yeah.
Because a lot of us just stay in the group of people that agree with us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So finding people who can challenge your perspective. Is that what you would say?
We're not necessarily finding people who can challenge perspective, entering situations where you're not living in your comfort zone.
Yes.
Situations which are different from what you've been used to. And from those situations, learning different things.
I love what you explained today when you said experience and how you need to experience things in order to learn.
Yes, because there were many things that were brushed aside as sources of knowledge. Nature could not be a source of knowledge. Experience was not treated as knowledge. But what I've learned through my lifetime is experience is a very big source of knowledge, and nature is a very big source of knowledge. In fact, this school here on this farm, the Beach Vidyapit, I define it as learning from nature. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the grandparents' school? You said you have like a...
Yes. So, when we started this Beach Vidyapit, which means the school of the seed, one of the early courses was the grandmother's university. Why? Because I was very troubled that people are throwing clothes away because they don't know how to mend one button, And so we said, okay, let's teach survival skills,
Yeah. And I love today when you said there's things you cannot learn from a book.
Yeah.
And then you need someone to do it with you.
Yeah.
Funny story, when I moved to Australia, I didn't know how to cook at all. And my mom gave me a recipe book, but I was making horrible food. And then my husband joined me, and the poor guy ate horrible food for 2 years until my grandma came over. And she showed me how to cook properly. Then I could make a proper curry.
That's experiential knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah. But the change was within a few weeks. But you have to have someone who knows and show you. Talk a little about resilience. Right? You've been attacked. You've been given a bullshit, like you were saying earlier. Where do you find that courage to, not give up and also not let it affect you?
So, I'm remembering when I was invited by the government of India, by the Environment Ministry, to look at mining in these mountains, purest limestone, up in these hills of Pasuri. And those days I used to be in Bangalore, so the ministry did not know Dehradun was my hometown. And around that time, I'd had my baby. So I grabbed the opportunity and came back here. And when I came back here, I of course did the mining study, which stopped the mining. But I remember one group of women walking into my little office, which originally used to be my mother's cowshed. And these people said, "What do you have against us? Why did you leave our mine out of the evaluation? And why hasn't been done?" So I said, "Where's your mine?" And they showed it. I said, "This wasn't in the official map. It's an illegal mine, obviously created by some people. So, but if you start a Chipko Andolan," Chipko was the movement of women hugging trees. I said, "I'll help. I'll come and join you." And they started a movement. The oldest woman was a woman called Ithwari Devi. And about 3 months, and they created a blockade. Because everywhere where there's mining, there's violence. And I know one of the biggest coal mines is now being created in Africa, in Australia. And when the women were in the blockade, the miner, who was a goon, had the women attacked. And the village was up in the mountain. So people would come to me on motorbikes And a young person came running on a motorbike and said, the women have been attacked. So I said, okay, I'll come and visit. So I thought I'd go to their homes and the women would be with bandages and plasters. And with the bandages and plasters, they were sitting in the tent, still blockading the mine. So I asked Itwari Devi, I said, what gives you the strength to continue to resist in spite of the violence that has been unleashed on you? And she said something I've never forgotten. And she said, we are walking on grass and the grass ground bounces back. You're walking under the trees and we take the leaves for fodder for our animals. And the trees and the leaves come back. The same power of nature that brings the leaves back and allows the grass to grow again is a power we have. That is the power of resilience. And so to have resilience, there are two qualities. The first is you don't look at yourself through the eyes of the oppressor. You look at yourself through your duty to the earth, your duty to fellow human beings. Once you found that path, then all the abuses by the oppressors are meaningless, And the second thing is you don't just find the right path to do the right things, but you also understand your strengths, knowing that you're part of nature. If nature can bounce back, we can bounce back too, can't we?
Very. Another word that I would describe after meeting you and coming here is humility. What would you say about humility and leadership, or in the movement for humanity?
So, I learned humility through my participation in the Chipko movement. Because after all, with the very conscious choice, I had decided to first study physics when too many women didn't study physics. And in physics to study quantum theory. That's why I went to Canada to do my PhD. But when I went to be a volunteer in the Chipko movement, I realized the women who'd never been to school, who didn't know how to read and write, knew so much about plant diversity, and I knew nothing. And that's when I realized that you can't be arrogant about your knowledge. Humility is a necessary virtue to learn. And I think humility goes hand in hand with the ability to learn more and to see all the knowledge others have, who, through the organizing of society, have been declared as not knowledgeable. That means the grandmothers, that means the peasant, that means other beings.
That's so true. And the other word, if I pick the third word to describe you, is your wisdom. And from being here, I've seen how many books you know and how many books you read. What else would you say about how can we get wiser today?
I think wisdom comes from those who've lived life. So to not shut out other people's experience, to learn from others. And for me, wisdom also comes from nature.
Like learning from the knots,
Yeah.
from biodiversity.
Yeah.
I've been saying we live in a greed economy for a long time because of mass production, and that's where I come from. That's where I've worked before. And I can see there's always this desire for more and more and more. You need a bigger house, you need a second car, you need more and more. And you came up with this word that I've heard for the first time here, enoughness. Where does that come from?
Well, it came from understanding the fact that limits have been broken and nature has limits and the human condition has limits. So to understand limits and live according to the limits, to understand ecological limits, this particular stream has this much water. And to sustain its ability to renew itself means to not take more than that. That is enough.
Have you heard it before?
No.
Stupid.
No, I hadn't heard it before.
Yeah, because it underlined it in red and it said doesn't exist, but I typed it. I think you should write a book. Dr. Shiva. One last question I had is maybe now a battlefield, I feel, for all of us, but you've talked about nutritional value is more important than yield. And I think that's a critical thing that we need to understand when we go to the supermarket. We go shocking because, like I said, the boxes have labels, but they mean nothing. And the fruits and vegetables don't have anything on there. They do just look at how pretty they look and we pick them.
Yeah. So, I'm not trained in agriculture, but in 1984, Punjab erupted in violence. And I was doing a study for the United Nations University, which is based in Tokyo. And I was working on conflicts over resources. I was working on rivers and forests. And I said, but here's a conflict, and it's not a forest and it's not a river, it's in agriculture. If you will let me understand the roots of this conflict, as part of the study, I'll be very grateful. So they let me. And so I wrote my book, The Violence of the Green Revolution, at that time. And that's when I started to understand what was happening to agriculture, how agriculture had become a battlefield, partly because industrial agriculture began as part of battle. Every chemical used in industrial farming is a war chemical. It began with Hitler's time. All chemical companies were war companies. So the fact that agriculture has become a battlefield is not an accident. It is the intention of the kind of farming we've ended up doing, and the categories of mismeasurement, I call it, that we have learned to live with. So part of what I took on as a challenge, having been trained in physics, was I said, they keep talking about more yield per acre, and that's why we must use chemicals. Is this really true? And I realized it's not true. So I said, but what do we do? What do we grow for food for? I said, we grow food for eating and for nourishment. So what matters in food is nutrition. And on the farm itself, I started to plant diversity. But we also have a National Institute of Nutrition, and I would take the tables of nutrition from there, and with the actual empirical measurements of the farm, and multiplying it with the nutrition tables, evolve this category of health per acre rather than yield per acre. Because the biggest health issues now are related to what we eat. There's a chronic disease epidemic, and it's all interconnected. It's not that you have one kind of disease and not another. All of them come together, and they all begin with the gut. Yeah.
So how we are in a world where cost of living is going up, health cost is going up, everything is going up, and I mean it's to me after coming here, it looks like it's a simple solution: grow your own food and eat your own food, know what's in the soil, take care of the soil, and you need less doctors, you need less money to buy groceries.
So you have to treat the soil and you have to treat agriculture as your medicine, as your doctor. I think I will stretch the health per acre a little more and say, when you see a farmer, don't see the farmer as producing a commodity. See the farmer as producing your health.
But we say it's a commodity. It's not a commodity. You're right.
Yeah. We have to reclaim it. We have to reclaim its true meaning. Yeah.
Because people go, it's potato.
Yeah.
Who cares?
Yeah.
No, we should care. Last question. Hey, two more questions I've got. It's about scaling. I come from marketing and business, and we always want to scale. And then you said, don't scale up. You said scale horizontally.
Yeah.
That's what you've said.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yes. So one of the quotes of Gandhi that has been very inspiring for me is when he was asked, what kind of society do you want? And he said, I do not want an hierarchical society where the top crushes the bottom that's supporting it. I want an ever expanding, never ascending circle of oceans where every person is a center of the circle, every village is a center of the circle, every society is a center of the circle. That's why I think in terms of decentered ways. Decentered doesn't mean there's no center, but everything is a center of its own organizing. And in terms of not thinking in terms of, when we think of scaling up, it's always in the vertical direction, But the fact is, you can scale out rather than up and include more. And that is what the innovation of our times really requires. How you can, and I have worked with very, very poor communities in India and America. I have worked in America where people will say, but we live in a food desert and you're asking us to grow our own food. I said, yes, you can grow your own food. Take a parking lot and turn it into a garden. And they've done that. They've done that and are creating food, which then the homeless people are eating. Yeah.
Yeah, community garden.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, last question I've got for you is, what advice would you give to your younger self? Let's say Dr. Shiva when she was 20.
Yes, first, as a principal, I don't give advice either to others or myself.
Even to yourself.
Yeah. And I'll live with my eyes and mind open, So you can't give advice in that situation. What you can do is understand the situation, and what's the best path. And so looking back at my life, I have absolutely no regrets. I would not change anything. I would still study quantum theory. I would still do all the studies I've done. Between my sister and me, my sister was the writer and I was the reluctant writer. I remember part of our English was writing essays, and we had been asked to write a 4-page essay, and I wrote 4 lines and gave it back to the teacher, and they said, how can you submit this as an essay? It's not an essay. I said, for me, it is. Every line I've written has meaning, and I could write it in even 1 line as an equation. But this is not a math class. It's an English class.
You could simplify everything.
Yeah.
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 That's a skill.
Yeah, but of course, the point is, what is simple for one person is complex for others. And the fact that I have written so many books is because I've written books through my experience of having to deal with situations. And out of my various debates has come a book.
Any last words for Australia or for women who are leading leadership position, Dr. Shiva?
Yeah. For Australia, I think there's so much to learn from the Aboriginal people of Australia. And for the women in Australia and the rest of the world, that, this is the time for us to not continue living through the oppressions that were created, to continue to call us the second sex, as Simone de Beauvoir wrote. We are not the second sex, but nor can we become the violent masculine. We cannot become the new oppressors, we have to define a new humanity. Well, even more importantly, I would say, that's why I have talked about Earth democracy. We have to define new Earth citizenship.
And the word Shakti
Shakti
comes to my mind while you're saying that.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned it a few times. Do you want to explain a bit about this word?
Shakti means the power to act, and Shakti is the feminine power to act. So we must all we all have Shakti in us, the inner power that we have, and we must all live Shakti, we must practice Shakti. We are Shakti.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Yeah.